Why do some people look at you and see nothing worth noticing? Sarah Catherine Brennan stood alone in Communications Room 7, bathed in the cold blue glow of tactical displays that hummed with encrypted traffic from 3 continents. Dawn was breaking over Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The Pacific stretched endlessly beyond the windows, indifferent and gray. She was 26 years old, 5'2". Auburn hair pulled tight against her skull in regulation fashion. Green eyes that caught details others missed, though most men never looked long enough to notice. To them, she was just another tech, just a radio girl. Her fingers moved across the MBITR tactical radio with practiced efficiency. Check frequency range. Verify encryption protocols. Test backup channels. The morning equipment inspection was as familiar as breathing, yet she approached each step with the precision her father had drilled into her from the moment she could understand what discipline meant. Master Chief Nathaniel Brennan, SEAL Team 2, killed in action, Ramadi, Iraq, November 14, 2006, 18 years ago. Sarah had been 8 years old. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp as broken glass. Her father kneeling in their Montana backyard, his weathered hands guiding her small fingers around the stock of a Remington 700. The rifle had seemed enormous then, impossibly heavy for a child. Feel that, Firefly, his voice rough as gravel but warm as summer rain. That's 6 pounds of trigger pull. When you master this, you master yourself. Breath control, patience. The ability to make one moment, one decision count for everything. He had deployed 3 weeks later. He never came home. Sarah blinked, forcing herself back to the present. The SATCOM terminal beeped, confirming uplink with the military satellite network. She logged the status, her handwriting precise and economical in the duty log. Behind her, the door crashed open with enough force to rattle the encryption key cabinet. Well, early bird gets the worm, huh, radio girl. Sergeant Cade Hutchkins filled the doorway like a wall of muscle and swagger. 6'3", 235 pounds of what he clearly believed was pure American fighting man. His uniform stretched tight across shoulders he'd built in the base gym, where he spent more time admiring his reflection than actually training. The kind of man who had never seen real combat but had memorized every line from every war movie ever made. Sarah didn't turn around. Sergeant, the equipment is ready for today's operations. All systems nominal. That's real sweet, sweetheart. Hutchkins swaggered into the room, boots heavy on the linoleum. But maybe you should stick to your radios and leave the fighting to men who actually know what they're doing. You know, the operators, the ones who do real work. She felt his eyes on her back, that particular quality of male assessment that made her skin crawl. The kind of look that reduced her to categories: too small, too young, too female. Never mind that she held a top-secret clearance. Never mind that her communication protocols had coordinated 17 successful operations in the last 6 months alone. Never mind any of it. Sarah turned, her face composed into the neutral mask she'd perfected over years of this particular brand of casual contempt. Is there something you need, Sergeant? Hutchkins grinned, revealing teeth too white to be natural. Just making sure you know your place, darling. Commander Garrett and his boys are wheels up in 4 hours for a real mission. Grown-up stuff. Wouldn't want you getting any ideas about playing soldier. Let them think you're weak. Her father's voice clear as if he were standing beside her. Then strike. I'll make sure all communications equipment is mission-ready, Sergeant. Will there be anything else? For a moment, something flickered behind Hutchkins' practiced smirk. Confusion, maybe. He'd expected her to bristle, to react, to give him the satisfaction of having gotten under her skin. Her calm robbed him of that victory, and he didn't quite know what to do with it. Yeah, there will be. You just remember who the real warriors are around here. He turned on his heel and left, the door slamming behind him with adolescent emphasis. Sarah waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor. Then she allowed herself one long, slow breath. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. The shift ended at 1400 hours. Sarah secured the communications room, logged her departure, and walked across the sun-baked tarmac to the parking structure where her ancient Honda Civic waited. The car was 20 years old, primer gray on 2 panels, but it ran. That was enough. The drive to her apartment took 12 minutes through the pleasant chaos of Coronado's streets. Tourists browsed overpriced boutiques. Joggers pounded the beachside paths. Somewhere, a street musician played acoustic guitar with more enthusiasm than skill. It was all so relentlessly, aggressively normal that Sarah sometimes felt like an alien observing human civilization through glass. Her apartment was a one-bedroom unit 3 blocks from the beach, small enough that the rent didn't completely devour her salary. She climbed the exterior stairs to the second floor, her boots making hollow sounds on the metal steps. The door opened before her key touched the lock. Commander James Garrett stood in the entrance, his solid frame backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the living room windows. 41 years old, 6 feet of lean muscle and accumulated scar tissue, with gray beginning to thread through dark hair cut high and tight. His blue eyes were the color of deep water, and right now they held the particular intensity that meant he was running combat calculations in his head. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a faded Navy t-shirt. In 2 hours, he would put on his combat gear and disappear into whatever classified nightmare the Navy had cooked up this time. "Hey," he said, his voice carrying that particular roughness that came from years of shouting orders over helicopter rotors and gunfire. "Hey, yourself." Sarah closed the door behind her, dropped her bag. "You didn't have to wait up. Last time I checked, this was my apartment too." A smile ghosted across his face, there and gone like smoke. "Besides, I wanted to see you before Wheels Up. Brief just ended. We're Oscar Mike at 1800. Oscar Mike, on the move. Military speak for the constant motion that defined their lives. Sarah moved into the kitchen, a space barely large enough for one person to cook and another to watch. She filled a glass with water from the tap, drank it in one long pull. Through the window above the sink, she could see a slice of the Pacific, gray-blue and eternal. "Where?" she asked. "Can't say." The usual, which meant classified, which meant dangerous, which meant James would be gone for anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks with zero communication. This was the rhythm of their marriage, presence and absence like breathing. Sarah turned to face him, leaning against the counter. Hutchkins was his usual charming self this morning. James' jaw tightened. What did he say? "Nothing I haven't heard before. I'm just a radio girl, should leave the real work to the real warriors." She kept her voice light, matter of fact. "It's fine. I've dealt with worse." "It's not fine." James crossed the small space between them in 2 strides, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You're worth 10 of him. Hell, you're worth 20. He's a garrison commando who's never seen real action and probably never will." "I know that, you know that." Sarah met his eyes. "But the Hutchkins of the world, they'll never know it, and that's okay. I don't need their validation." James studied her face, reading the micro-expressions that most people missed. After 3 years of marriage and 5 years before that of him keeping a careful, honorable distance while she grew from the captain's daughter into a woman in her own right, he knew her better than anyone alive. "Your father would be proud of you," he said quietly. And there it was, the thing they rarely spoke about but that lived between them like a ghost. Nathaniel Brennan, the man who had taught Sarah everything about being strong, the man who had introduced her to James when she was 17, fresh-faced and idealistic, still believing the world made sense. The man who had made James promise on his deathbed in a military hospital to look after her, to protect her, to give her the chance to become whoever she wanted to be. James had kept that promise. He'd stayed away while she went to college, while she enlisted, while she earned her place at Coronado. He'd watched from a distance as she became the woman standing before him now. And when she'd finally approached him, 3 years ago, when she'd looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not a kid anymore, and I know what I want," he'd still made her wait 6 months. Made sure she was certain. made sure he wasn't taking advantage of the trust Nathaniel had placed in him. But she had been certain, she was still certain. "I hope so," Sarah said softly. "I hope he'd be proud." He would be. James pulled her close, his arms solid and sure around her. For a moment they stood there in the small kitchen with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and the distant sound of surf rolling in from the Pacific. For a moment, the world was still. Then James' phone buzzed. He pulled back, checked the screen, his expression shifting into something harder, more focused. "I have to go." Sarah nodded. She'd been through this ritual dozens of times. The sudden departure, the long silence, the eventual return, sometimes whole, sometimes carrying new scars, always carrying new ghosts. "Be careful." "Always am." He kissed her forehead, then her lips, soft and brief. "I love you." "I love you too." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt far too final. Sarah stood alone in the apartment, listening to his footsteps descend the metal stairs, listening to his truck engine start and fade into the Coronado traffic. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on her like deep water. She moved to the window, watched the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, James was preparing to step into danger. Somewhere out there, men like Hutchkins were making jokes and polishing their egos, safe in the knowledge that they'd never have to prove themselves where it mattered. And somewhere, buried in Arlington National Cemetery, her father rested beneath white marble, his sacrifice reduced to dates and ranks carved in stone. Sarah closed her eyes, and for just a moment she let herself feel it. The loneliness, the fear, the bone-deep exhaustion of always having to prove she belonged in spaces that didn't want her. Then she opened her eyes, squared her shoulders, and got to work. There were always reports to file, equipment to maintain, protocols to review. The work never stopped. Neither did she. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that in 72 hours everything would change. The mission James was heading into wasn't what anyone thought it was. And the skills her father had taught her, the patience and precision and cold, clear focus, would be tested in ways she'd never imagined. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't the ones you train for. Sometimes, they're the ones that find you when you're just trying to survive another day. Have you ever noticed how the worst things always happen when you're not paying attention? 72 hours later, Sarah was sitting in communications room 7 during the graveyard shift when the world tilted sideways. It was 3:47 hours. The base was quiet, settled into that particular stillness that comes in the hours before dawn when even the most disciplined warriors allow themselves to sleep. She was alone, monitoring encrypted traffic, sipping cold coffee that tasted like regret and battery acid. The SATCOM terminal beeped. Incoming priority transmission. Sarah's fingers moved automatically, entering her credentials, opening the encrypted channel. What came through made her blood run cold. SEAL Team 5 had walked into an ambush. James' team. The operation they'd been sent on, a simple reconnaissance mission in the mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border, had been compromised. Someone had leaked the mission details. Someone had sold them out. And now 8 of America's most elite warriors were pinned down in a valley with enemy forces closing in from 3 sides. The transmission was fragmentary, punctuated by bursts of static and the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons fire. Sarah could hear James' voice, strained but controlled, calling for extraction. Could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire, the deeper boom of grenades. Could hear men shouting, coordinating, fighting for their lives. She worked the radios with fingers that refused to shake, coordinating with the quick reaction force scrambling out of Bagram. But even as she did, she could hear the math working itself out in her head with cold, merciless logic. The QRF was 40 minutes out, maybe 35 if they pushed the helicopters past safe limits. James and his team didn't have 40 minutes. They probably didn't have 20. The transmission cut out. Sarah tried to re-establish contact, tried every frequency, every protocol, every trick she knew. Nothing. Just empty static hissing through the speakers like the sound of her worst fears becoming real. She sat frozen, her hand still on the transmitter, her mind racing through possibilities. They could be moving, repositioning, maintaining radio silence to avoid giving away their location. They could be fine. They could be. No, she couldn't think about that. Couldn't let her mind go to the places where James lay bleeding in some Afghan valley, where the men she'd coordinated missions for, laughed with in the mess hall, became statistics in casualty reports. The door to the communications room opened. Lieutenant Marcus Callahan entered, his face drawn and pale. He was SEAL Team 5's executive officer, and he'd been in the operations center when the ambush went down. Sarah had met him a dozen times, always professional, always respectful. Right now, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to step away from the console." "Sir, I can." "That's an order, petty officer. This is a combat operation involving your spouse. You're too close to it. I'm having someone else take over the watch." He was right, of course. Regulations were clear. But regulations didn't account for the fact that she knew these systems better than anyone on base, that she could coordinate communications in her sleep, that she might be the difference between James coming home and James becoming another name on another headstone in Arlington. But she also knew that arguing would only waste time. So she stood, logged out of the systems, and walked out of the communications room with her spine straight and her face composed. She made it all the way to the women's head before her legs gave out. She sat on the cold tile floor, her back against the wall, and let herself shake. Time passed. She didn't know how much. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. Eventually, she pulled herself together, washed her face in the sink, and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. The base was beginning to wake. She could hear the distant sound of reveille, the rumble of trucks, the organized chaos of a military installation spinning up for another day. She went to the one place she knew she'd be left alone. The long-range rifle qualification course sat at the far edge of the base, a stretch of scrubland dotted with targets at various distances. Sarah signed out an M4 from the armory, not a precision rifle, but close enough, and made her way to Lane 3. The dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah loaded the magazine, chambered around, and settled into a shooting position. Through the scope, the world telescoped into clarity. A target at 300 meters, then 500, then 800. She fired, adjusted, fired again. Each shot was perfect, each adjustment precise. This at least made sense. This she could control. She was on her 15th magazine when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around, just continued her shooting rhythm. Breathe. Aim. Fire. Breathe. Petty Officer Brennan. She recognized the voice. Admiral Richard Crawford, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. Sarah immediately stood, lowering the rifle, snapping to attention. At ease. The Admiral moved to stand beside her, looking out at the range. He was a lean man in his late 50s, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. Hell of a grouping. "Thank you, sir. Your father taught you to shoot." Sarah hesitated. "Yes, sir." "Nathaniel Brennan, Master Chief, SEAL Team 2. I served with him in Ramadi. Good man, better warrior." The Admiral paused. "I was there when he died." Sarah's throat tightened. She'd never known who had been there, never asked for the details. Some things were too painful to know. "He died protecting his team," the Admiral continued. "Took 3 rounds to the chest covering a retreat, kept fighting until every one of his men was safe. Then he just sat down, like he decided his work was done." The Admiral's voice was rough. "Last thing he said was your name." The world blurred. Sarah blinked hard, forcing it back into focus. "I'm telling you this," the Admiral said, "because you need to understand something. Your husband is out there right now in a situation that looks impossible. But James Garrett is Nathaniel Brennan's protege. Your father trained him, mentored him, passed on every lesson he'd ever learned. If anyone can bring his team home from an impossible situation, it's James, because he learned from the best. Sarah found her voice. "Have you heard anything, sir? Any updates?" The Admiral's expression hardened. "The QRF made contact 20 minutes ago. Team 5 is alive, all 8 of them. They fought their way to a defensible position and held it until help arrived. James took shrapnel to his leg and one of his men has a sucking chest wound, but they're all breathing. Extraction's in progress now." Relief hit Sarah like a physical force. Her knees went weak. "Thank God." "But that's not why I'm here." The Admiral's voice dropped lower. "We have a bigger problem. The ambush wasn't random. Someone leaked the mission details. Someone with access to classified operational planning. We have a traitor in our ranks, Sarah. Someone who's been selling SEAL team operations to enemy forces for months." The implications crashed over her. All those missions she'd coordinated. All those operations that had gone smoothly and the few that hadn't. The close calls. The unexpected enemy positions. The intelligence that never quite matched reality. "Who?" she asked. "We don't know yet, but we're going to find out." The Admiral met her eyes. "And when we do, I'm going to need someone I can trust absolutely. Someone with your father's integrity and your skills. Someone who knows these systems inside and out. I'm going to need you, Petty Officer Brennan. The question is, are you ready?" Sarah looked down at the rifle in her hands. Her father's rifle, really. The weapon he'd used to teach her about discipline, control, the ability to make one moment count for everything. She thought about James, bleeding in an Afghan valley because someone had betrayed him. Thought about all the other operators who'd been put at risk, all the close calls that shouldn't have been close at all. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I'm ready." The Admiral nodded. "Good, because what comes next is going to test you in ways you can't imagine. This isn't about communications protocols or radio frequencies anymore. This is about hunting a predator who knows how we think, how we operate, how we hunt. Someone who's been one of us." He turned to leave, then paused. "Your father once told me that the hardest fights aren't against the enemy you can see. They're against the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing your uniform, speaking your language, betraying everything you stand for. He said those fights require a different kind of courage. Not the courage to face death, but the courage to face the truth, no matter how ugly it gets." Sarah watched him walk away, his words settling over her like a weight. Somewhere in this base, someone wore the same uniform she did, took the same oaths, and was selling out his brothers for money. Somewhere, a traitor was planning his next move, confident he'd never be caught. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Nathaniel Brennan's daughter was coming for him. And when she found him, he'd learned the same lesson her father had taught 100 enemies in a dozen countries. There's nowhere to hide from the truth, and the truth shoots straight. What does betrayal look like when it wears a friendly face? The investigation began quietly, conducted in secure conference rooms where the walls couldn't talk and the air felt thick with suspicion. Admiral Crawford assembled a small team, 2 Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents, a signals intelligence specialist, and Sarah. They worked in 12-hour shifts, combing through mission logs, communication records, financial statements, and surveillance footage, looking for the pattern, the anomaly, the crack in someone's carefully constructed lie. 3 days into the investigation, James came home. Sarah was at the apartment when she heard his truck pull into the parking lot, heard his uneven footsteps on the metal stairs. He was on crutches, his left leg wrapped in bandages from hip to ankle where shrapnel had torn through muscle and barely missed the femoral artery. His face was drawn, lined with exhaustion and pain, but his eyes were clear. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Sarah crossed the space between them, her arms careful around him, mindful of his injuries. "Hey, yourself." They stood there for a long moment, not speaking. Sometimes words weren't necessary. Sometimes just breathing the same air, feeling the same heartbeat, was enough. "Crawford told me they read you in," James said finally. "Told me you're part of the investigation." "Yeah." "Be careful, Sarah. Whoever this is, they're smart. They've been operating for months without getting caught. They're not going to make it easy." She pulled back, met his eyes. "I know, but we're going to find them." James studied her face and something flickered in his expression. Pride, maybe, or concern, or both. "Your father used to say that the most dangerous enemy is the one who knows how you think. The one who can anticipate your moves because they've lived your life, trained in your methods, learned your patterns." "Did he ever say how to beat that enemy?" "Yeah." A ghost of a smile touched James' lips. "He said you have to be willing to change the pattern, to do the unexpected, to break your own rules if that's what it takes to win." Sarah absorbed this, filed it away. "Get some rest. I have to go back to the operations center." "Sarah," James caught her hand, "when this is over, when we find whoever did this, promise me you won't lose yourself in the anger. Your father," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father carried a lot of rage at the end, at the politicians who sent him to fight a war with one hand tied behind his back, at the bureaucrats who cared more about optics than victory, at all the waste and stupidity. That rage made him a better fighter, but it hollowed him out, made him reckless. I don't want that for you." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I promise." But she wasn't sure she could keep that promise. Because the more she dug into the investigation, the more the anger built, cold and focused and utterly merciless. The break came on day 7. The signals intelligence specialist, a quiet woman named Rachel Torres who could make computers confess their secrets, found the digital footprint. A series of encrypted messages sent from a terminal at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado to an IP address in Karachi. The encryption was good, military grade, but not quite good enough. Torres cracked it after 48 hours of sustained effort, and what she found made Sarah's blood run ice cold. Detailed mission plans, unit designations, insertion coordinates, extraction schedules, everything an enemy would need to set a perfect ambush, and the messages all originated from the same terminal. Communications Room 7. "It's someone with regular access to your workspace," Crawford said, spreading the evidence across the conference table. "Someone who knows the systems, knows the protocols, knows how to move through the digital architecture without leaving obvious traces." Sarah stared at the printouts, her mind racing through possibilities. Communications Room 7 was her domain, but it wasn't exclusively hers. Other technicians rotated through. Officers checked in and out. And then there were the operators who sometimes used the equipment for mission planning, for coordination, for Sergeant Cade Hutchins. The name fell from her lips before she'd consciously completed the thought. But once said, it made terrible sense. Hutchins had access. He'd been on base during every compromised operation, and he'd been so eager to belittle her, to establish himself as superior, to make sure everyone knew she was just a radio girl who couldn't possibly understand real military operations. Classic misdirection. Keep everyone looking at the small, quiet woman while the loud, arrogant man did his work in plain sight. "You're sure?" Crawford asked. "No, but it fits. He's always in and out of the communications room, always makes a point of how much better he is than everyone else, always so eager to prove he's a real warrior." Sarah paused. "And he's been living above his means. New truck, designer watches, takes trips to Vegas every other month, on a sergeant's salary." Torres was already pulling up financial records. Within an hour they had it. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, wire transfers from shell corporations, a pattern of deposits that coincided exactly with compromised operations. The digital trail led directly to Sergeant Cade Hutchins. "We need to move carefully," Crawford said. "We can't just arrest him. If he spooks, we lose the whole network. We need to know who he's working with, who he's selling to, how deep this goes." "I have an idea," Sarah said quietly. They all turned to look at her. "Let me set a trap, feed him false information about an upcoming operation, something too good to resist. When he takes the bait, we follow the trail all the way up." Crawford frowned. "That puts you in direct contact with him if he suspects anything." "He won't. He thinks I'm incompetent, just a radio girl playing at being important. He'll never see me coming." The Admiral studied her for a long moment. "Your father would have hated this plan." "I know, but he also would have understood why it's necessary." Crawford nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this by the book. You wear a wire. We have agents ready to move the second things go sideways, and if at any point you feel unsafe, you abort. Understood?" "Understood." 2 days later, Sarah was back in Communications Room 7, running her morning equipment check, when Hutchkins swaggered in right on schedule. "Morning, sweetheart. Keeping my radios warm for me." She didn't turn around. "Morning, Sergeant. Everything's ready for the day's operations." "Good girl." He moved closer, that predatory assessment in his eyes that she'd learned to hate. "Hey, I heard something interesting. Rumor is there's a big operation coming up. High-value target, real door-kicking stuff." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral. "I wouldn't know anything about that, Sergeant. I just maintain the equipment." "Come on, radio girl. You hear everything that goes through this room. Don't tell me you haven't picked up some chatter." His voice dropped, took on a false friendliness that made her skin crawl. "Between you and me, I like to know what the real warriors are up to. Makes me feel like I'm part of the action, you know." This was it, the moment. Sarah turned to face him, letting uncertainty flicker across her features. I really shouldn't." "It's not like you'd be compromising anything. I have the clearance, I'm just curious." He leaned against the console, too close. "Help a guy out." Sarah hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There was a flash traffic message this morning. SEAL Team 3 is being tasked with a direct action mission. High-value target in the Hindu Kush. They're calling it Operation Righteous Fury." She watched his eyes, saw the flash of interest quickly masked. "No kidding, when?" 72 hours. Insertion at 300 local time." She turned back to the console, her heart hammering. "But you didn't hear that from me." "Our secret." Hutchkins straightened, his smirk returning. "See, that wasn't so hard. You're learning, radio girl." He left. Sarah sat perfectly still, counting her heartbeats, waiting for her hands to stop shaking. The wire taped to her ribs had captured every word. In a surveillance van 2 blocks away, Tors and the NCIS agents were already tracking Hutchkins' movements. 20 minutes later, her radio crackled. Tor's voice, calm and professional. "He's on the move. Just accessed a terminal in Building 17. He's sending encrypted messages now." Sarah closed her eyes. "Can you trace them?" "Already on it, and Sarah, we got him. The messages are going to 3 different locations. One in Karachi, one in Dubai, one in Jesus, one in Washington, D.C. D.C. Yeah, congressional IP address. This goes higher than we thought." The investigation exploded outward like shrapnel. Within 12 hours, they had names. Within 24, they had evidence. Hutchkins was the field operative, the man on the ground selling operational details. But he was working for someone bigger, someone with connections in Congress, in defense contracting, in the shadowy world where money and power intersect and patriotism becomes just another commodity to be bought and sold. Colonel Dalton Wade, retired SEAL, former commander of Naval Special Warfare Group 2, current defense consultant with contracts worth hundreds of millions. He'd been selling SEAL team operations to enemy forces for 18 months, using Hutchkins as his conduit, and funneling the profits through a network of shell corporations that stretched across 3 continents. "We're moving on Wade tonight," Crawford told Sarah in the secure conference room. "He's at a private military contractor conference in Virginia. FBI is coordinating the arrest." "What about Hutchkins?" "We take him at the same time. Simultaneous operations. They won't have time to warn each other." The Admiral paused. "You did good work, petty officer. Your father would be proud. But Sarah barely heard him, because something was nagging at her, some detail that didn't fit. She pulled up Hutchkins' file, scanned through his service record, and there it was, the thing that had been bothering her. Sir, Hutchkins was stationed at Dam Neck for 3 years, 2018 to 2021. So was my father. They overlapped for 6 months before Dad was killed. Sarah's throat tightened. What if Wade was already recruiting back then? What if he approached my father first? Crawford's expression darkened. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting my father might have found out what Wade was doing, might have confronted him, might have been the reason Dad's team walked into that ambush in Ramadi. The words came faster now, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Wade would have had access to operational planning. He could have leaked Dad's position, could have set up the ambush that killed him. The Admiral was quiet for a long moment. We'll investigate. But Sarah, you need to understand, even if that's true, even if Wade killed your father, you can't be part of the arrest. You're too close to this. I understand. But she didn't understand, didn't accept it. Because if Dalton Wade had killed her father, if he'd betrayed Nathaniel Brennan and then spent 18 years profiting from that betrayal, selling out more SEALs, getting more warriors killed, then regulations didn't matter, protocol didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was making sure he faced justice, and sometimes justice wore a sniper's scope. That night, while federal agents prepared to arrest Colonel Dalton Wade in Virginia, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She signed out her father's M40A3 rifle from the secure weapons locker where it had sat for 18 years. She loaded her gear into her ancient Honda, and she drove north through the darkness, toward a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. Because some debts can only be paid in full, and Nathaniel Brennan's daughter was about to collect. Have you ever wondered how far you go for someone you love? Sarah drove through the night, the M40A3 rifle secured in the back seat, her father's ghost riding shotgun through the darkness. The highway unreeled before her headlights like a ribbon of black silk. She should have been exhausted. She'd been awake for 36 hours straight. But adrenaline and anger kept her sharp, kept her focused, kept her moving north toward Virginia and the reckoning she'd been building toward since she was 8 years old. Her phone buzzed. James. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. He tried to stop her, tried to talk her down, tried to make her see reason. But reason had stopped applying somewhere around the moment she'd realized that Colonel Dalton Wade had murdered her father. The FBI was planning to arrest Wade at 600 hours at the military contractor conference. Standard procedure. Surround the hotel, move agents into position, execute the warrant. Clean, professional, legal. But Sarah knew something they didn't. Wade was a SEAL, trained in evasion and escape. The moment he sensed the net closing, he'd run. And running was something SEALs were very good at. She pulled into a rest stop at 300 hours, killed the engine, and checked her gear. The rifle was pristine, maintained with religious devotion by the armorers who'd kept it in trust since Nathaniel Brennan's death. She ran her hands over the stock, felt the worn places where her father's hands had gripped it 1,000 times. This weapon had accounted for 73 confirmed kills across 2 deployments. It had been in Ramadi when her father died. Now it was going back to war one more time. Sarah assembled the pieces of her plan with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The conference hotel was in McLean, Virginia, a sprawling complex with multiple exits and a helipad on the roof. Wade would have a contingency plan. Men like him always did. And his contingency would involve getting airborne as quickly as possible, putting distance between himself and the authorities before they could close the trap. She found her position on a ridge 800 meters from the hotel, concealed in a stand of oak trees that gave her a clear sight line to the helipad. Through the Schmidt and Bender scope, she could see FBI agents taking positions around the building's perimeter. Professional, thorough, completely focused on the ground-level exits. No one was watching the sky. Sarah settled into her shooting position, extended the bipod, and began her calculations. Wind speed, 12 miles per hour gusting to 15. Temperature, 48 degrees. Humidity, 63%. Distance to target, 847 yards. She'd made this shot 1,000 times on the range. Now she'd make it count. The sun rose slowly, painting the Virginia sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah watched through the scope as the hotel came alive. Maintenance workers, early rising conference attendees, FBI agents in poorly concealed positions. And then, at precisely 5:45 hours, Colonel Dalton Wade emerged from a side entrance. He was everything Sarah had imagined and worse. 58 years old, silver hair, the kind of distinguished good looks that played well on defense contractor brochures. He wore an expensive suit, carried himself with the confident bearing of a man who'd never faced real consequences. Two men flanked him, security, probably former military themselves. They moved quickly toward a black SUV. The FBI moved in. Agents converged from three directions, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Wade's security reached for their weapons. For a moment it looked like everything was about to go sideways. Then Wade raised his hands, smiled that distinguished smile, and started talking. The consummate professional, the respectful former SEAL. Just a misunderstanding, gentlemen. Happy to clear this up. But Sarah could see what the FBI couldn't. Could see Wade's eyes flicking toward the roof, toward the helipad where a Bell 412 helicopter sat with rotors beginning to spin up. Could see the calculation in his expression, the predator measuring escape routes. The FBI agents were trained, competent, professional, but they weren't ready for what happened next. Wade's security didn't draw their weapons. Instead, they pulled grenades, flashbangs, not lethal but enough to create chaos. The devices detonated with brilliant light and overwhelming sound. FBI agents staggered back, momentarily disoriented. Wade ran, not toward the SUV, toward the building. Through a service entrance into the hotel, moving with the practiced speed of a man who'd rehearsed this exact scenario. His security covered his retreat, laying down suppressing fire with weapons that had appeared from nowhere. The FBI returned fire. Someone went down. Someone screamed. And Wade kept running, kept moving, kept climbing. Sarah tracked him through the scope as he emerged on the roof 60 seconds later. The helicopter was fully spun up now, a pilot in civilian clothes at the controls. Wade sprinted across the helipad, covering ground with the speed and efficiency of a man half his age. 30 meters, 20, 10. The FBI agents were fighting through the building, but they were too slow, too cautious, too bound by rules about use of force in civilian areas. Wade reached the helicopter, hauled himself into the cabin. The Bell 412 lifted off, nose tilting forward to gain speed. Sarah's mind shifted into that cold, clear space where nothing existed except her, the rifle, and the target. The world slowed. Her heartbeat became a metronome. She calculated without conscious thought. Wind speed, 14 miles per hour gusting to 18. Temperature, 52 degrees. Humidity, 58%. The helicopter was accelerating, moving at approximately 45 knots on a heading of 270 degrees. Distance to target, 847 yards. The shot was nearly impossible. A moving helicopter at nearly half a mile in gusty morning wind, with the pilot taking evasive maneuvers. But Sarah had been making impossible shots since she was 8 years old. She adjusted for windage, 2.1 moa right. Elevation, 8.3 moa up. Lead, 12 feet to account for the helicopter's lateral movement. The Coriolis effect at this latitude, negligible but present. Wade's face appeared in the helicopter's side window. He was looking back at the hotel, at the firefight still raging on the ground, at what he was leaving behind. He never saw what was coming. Sarah exhaled slowly, let her breath carry away all doubt, all fear, all hesitation. At the bottom of her breath, in that moment of perfect stillness between heartbeats, She squeezed the trigger. The M40A3 roared. The .308 Winchester round traveled at 2,600 feet per second, covering 847 yards in 1.8 seconds. It punched through the helicopter's side window, through Colonel Dalton Wade's skull, and out the opposite side. Wade slumped forward. The pilot panicked. The helicopter yawed hard to the left, rotors biting air at the wrong angle. It spun once, twice, then fell from the sky like a broken bird. The crash was spectacular. Metal and fuel and flesh meeting Earth at terminal velocity. The explosion that followed was almost anticlimactic. Sarah lowered the rifle, her hands perfectly steady. Through the scope, she could see FBI agents running toward the wreckage, could see emergency vehicles converging, could see the organized chaos of authorities trying to make sense of what had just happened. She packed up her gear with methodical efficiency, broke down the rifle, stowed it in its case, walked back to her car. By the time the first FBI agents began searching the surrounding area for the source of the shot, Sarah was already 5 miles away, heading south on I-95, back toward Coronado and whatever consequences awaited. But she didn't regret it, couldn't regret it, because Dalton Wade had betrayed everything a SEAL was supposed to stand for, had sold out his brothers, had gotten Nathaniel Brennan killed. And when the law moved too slowly, when justice seemed like it might slip away through legal technicalities and expensive lawyers, someone had to step up. Someone had to make the hard call, make the impossible shot, do what needed to be done. Her phone buzzed. James. This time she answered. "Where are you?" His voice was tight, controlled rage barely held in check. "Driving home." "Sarah, what did you do?" "What needed to be done." Silence, long enough that she thought he might have hung up. Then, "You killed him." "Yes." "They're going to arrest you. You know that, right? NCIS is already pulling traffic camera footage. They'll trace you to Virginia. They'll match ballistics. They'll put you away for murder." "I know." "Then why?" Sarah thought about her father, thought about that Montana backyard, those patient hands guiding hers, that rough voice teaching her about discipline and control and making one moment count for everything. Because he killed Dad, and because if I didn't stop him, he'd just disappear into the system. Rich lawyers, political connections. Maybe he'd do a few years in a minimum security facility, maybe not even that. And all those SEALs he got killed, all that blood on his hands, it would just not matter. "It matters," James said quietly. "But this isn't how we do things, Sarah. This isn't justice. This is revenge." "Maybe sometimes they're the same thing." "They're not, and you know that. Your father knew that. He spent his whole career proving you could be a warrior and still honor the rules, still respect the law, still be better than the enemy." James' voice cracked. "He wouldn't want this for you." Sarah felt something break inside her, a dam that had been holding back 18 years of grief and rage and loss. "He's not here to tell me what he'd want. He's dead, and the man who killed him just tried to escape in a helicopter." "So you shot him out of the sky?" "Yes." More silence. Sarah could hear James breathing, hear him struggling with what to say, how to bridge the gap that had just opened between them. "Come home," he finally said. "Don't run, don't make this worse. Come home, turn yourself in, let me get you a lawyer. We'll fight this, together." "Okay." "Promise me, Sarah, promise me you won't run." "I promise." She ended the call, kept driving south. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning haze. Traffic thickened as she approached the D.C. suburbs. Just another car on just another highway, carrying just another person going about their ordinary day. Except Sarah Catherine Brennan had just killed a man, and she felt no remorse, no doubt, just a cold, clear certainty that she'd done what her father couldn't do. She'd made Dalton Wade answer for his crimes. The rest, the arrest, the trial, the consequences, would come. She'd face them with the same discipline and control her father had taught her. But for now, driving through the Virginia morning with her father's rifle in the back seat and her father's ghost finally at peace, Sarah allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, the debt had been paid, and Nathaniel Brennan's daughter had proven she was exactly the warrior he'd raised her to be. Sometimes the hardest shots aren't the ones you take at 800 yards. They're the ones you take knowing they'll cost you everything. But when the target is worth it, when the cause is just, when the alternative is letting evil slip away unpunished, you take the shot anyway. What happens when the truth finally catches up to you? Sarah made it as far as Quantico before the police intercepted her. Two Virginia State Police cruisers, lights flashing, pulling her over on the shoulder of I-95. She didn't resist, didn't run, just put her hands on the steering wheel where they could see them and waited for the officers to approach. They were professional, cautious, weapons drawn but not pointed, voices firm but not hostile. "Step out of the vehicle, please, ma'am, hands where we can see them." She complied. They patted her down, found nothing. She'd left her service weapon at home. The only weapon in the car was her father's rifle, and she declared it when they asked. "Sarah Catherine Brennan, you're under arrest for the murder of Colonel Dalton Wade." The handcuffs were cold against her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." Sarah listened to the Miranda warning, memorizing every word even though she already knew them by heart. The officers were doing their job, following procedure, being respectful about it, even. One of them was a veteran. She could see it in his bearing, in the way he handled the rifle with practiced familiarity when they inventoried her vehicle. "Marine Corps?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 2 deployments to Helmand Province." "My father was a SEAL, Master Chief Nathaniel Brennan." Something flickered in the Marine's expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect. "I heard about what Wade did, what he was selling. A lot of good men died because of him." "Yeah. For what it's worth, ma'am, I understand why you did it. But understanding and agreeing are different things." "I know." They transported her to a federal holding facility in Alexandria, processed her, took her fingerprints, her photograph, her statement, which consisted of her name, rank, and serial number, followed by a request for legal counsel. They gave her a phone call. She used it to call James. "I'm at the Alexandria Detention Center," she said when he answered. "I know, I'm already on my way. Got you a lawyer. Former JAG officer, best in the business. His name is Michael Chen, and he's waiting to meet with you." "James." "Don't say anything to anyone until Chen gets there. Understand? Not a word." "I understand." "I love you, Sarah. We're going to get through this." She wanted to believe him, but she'd killed a man in front of dozens of FBI agents and at least 3 traffic cameras. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight. She was going to prison, and no amount of love or legal expertise was going to change that. Michael Chen arrived 2 hours later. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He sat across from Sarah in the interview room and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence," he said. "It's bad, multiple witnesses, video footage, ballistic evidence, a public confession to your husband over an open phone line that was being monitored by NCIS." He paused. "But it's not unwinnable." "How?" "We argue necessity defense. Wade was a clear and present danger. He was fleeing arrest, likely to disappear with classified information that could cost more American lives. You were a trained Navy marksman in a position to stop him when law enforcement couldn't. You made a split-second decision to protect national security." Sarah shook her head. "That's not why I did it." "I don't care why you did it. I care about what I can prove in court." Chen leaned forward. "Listen to me, Petty Officer Brennan. The prosecution is going to paint you as a vigilante, a woman consumed by revenge who took the law into her own hands. They're going to ignore Wade's crimes and focus entirely on yours. Our job is to reframe the narrative, to make the jury see you as a patriot who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. But it wasn't impossible. I chose revenge. I chose to kill him because of what he did to my father. Then you'll spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Chen's voice was flat, matter of fact. Is that what you want? Is that what your father would want? Sarah thought about this. Thought about her father's voice, his lessons, his belief that discipline and honor mattered more than anything. Would he want her to lie, to hide behind legal technicalities? Or would he want her to face the consequences of her actions with the same integrity he'd lived by? I need some time to think. Time is something we don't have much of. The arraignment is tomorrow. I need to know how you want to plead. I'll tell you tomorrow. Chen left. Sarah sat alone in the holding cell, staring at the concrete walls, running through scenarios in her head. She could fight, could let Chen build his defense, could maybe walk away with a reduced sentence, or she could tell the truth, face the consequences, accept that she'd stepped outside the law and pay the price. The door opened. James walked in, moving stiffly on his crutches, his legs still bandaged. He sat down across from her, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Chen told me you're having doubts about the defense, he said finally. It's built on a lie, the whole thing. I didn't shoot Wade to protect national security. I shot him because I wanted him dead. I know, but intent doesn't change the outcome. Wade is still gone, he can't hurt anyone else, and maybe that's what matters. Dad wouldn't have done it this way. James was quiet for a moment. Your father made plenty of choices that kept him up at night. Plenty of calls that bent the rules, crossed lines, violated the neat categories lawyers like to put things in. The difference is, he had the benefit of operating in a war zone where those choices were expected. You don't have that luxury. So I should lie. I'm saying you should survive. Because the world needs people like you, Sarah. People who understand that sometimes the rules don't work, that sometimes justice requires hard calls. But you can't make those calls from a prison cell. Sarah felt tears building, fought them back. I keep thinking about that moment. Me on the ridge, him in the helicopter. I could have let him go. Could have let the FBI handle it. But I looked through that scope and all I could see was Dad's grave. All I could feel was 18 years of him being gone while Wade got richer, got more powerful, got away with it. I know. And I'd do it again. Given the same choice, the same circumstances, I'd pull that trigger every single time. So what does that make me? James reached across the table, took her hand. Human. It makes you human. Flawed and angry and trying to do right in a world that doesn't always make it clear what right even means. That's not good enough. Maybe not, but it's all we've got. The arraignment happened the next morning. Sarah stood before a federal judge in Alexandria, wearing the orange jumpsuit of a pretrial detainee, and listened as the charges were read. Murder in the first degree, unlawful use of a firearm, obstruction of justice. The list went on. When asked how she pled, Sarah took a breath, looked at James in the gallery, looked at Chen beside her, thought about her father's hands guiding hers around that Remington 700, about his voice teaching her that one moment, one decision, could count for everything. Not guilty, Your Honor. The prosecution asked for her to be held without bail. Flight risk, they argued, trained military operative, access to weapons and tactical knowledge. Chen countered with her clean record, her military service, her ties to the community. The judge set bail at $500,000. James posted it within an hour. Someone, Sarah never found out who, had made an anonymous donation to cover the amount. Probably one of her father's old teammates. Probably someone who understood what Dalton Wade's death meant to the SEAL community. She walked out of the Alexandria Detention Center into the gray Virginia afternoon, and for the first time in 72 hours, she could breathe. But the trial was coming. The evidence was overwhelming, and Sarah Catherine Brennan was about to face the hardest fight of her life, not against enemy combatants in some distant war zone, but against the weight of the law itself. Sometimes courage isn't about taking the shot. Sometimes it's about facing what comes after. Can a life be measured in the moments that define it? The trial began 6 months later in a federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. Outside, protesters lined the streets, some calling Sarah a hero, others calling her a murderer. Inside, the courtroom was packed with reporters, military personnel, and family members of SEALs who died in operations Wade had compromised. Sarah sat at the defense table in her Navy dress uniform, her spine straight, her hands folded. She'd lost weight during the months of house arrest. Her face had grown thinner, harder, aged by stress and sleepless nights, but her eyes were clear. Whatever happened, she'd face it with the dignity her father had taught her. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They called FBI agents who testified about the botched arrest, called the pilot of the helicopter, the only survivor, who described the shot that killed Wade, called ballistics experts who matched the fatal round to Sarah's father's rifle, called digital forensics specialists who traced her movements from Coronado to Virginia using traffic cameras and cell phone data. They presented phone records showing her conversation with James, in which she'd essentially confessed, presented psychological evaluations suggesting she'd been consumed by revenge, presented a narrative of a young woman who'd lost her father and spent 18 years planning retribution. Michael Chen did his best. He called character witnesses, fellow sailors who testified about Sarah's professionalism, her skill, her dedication. He called SEAL team members who spoke about the operations Wade had compromised, the men who died because of his betrayal. He tried to paint Sarah's actions as a necessary intervention when legal channels were failing. But the prosecution had one final witness, one that changed everything. Admiral Richard Crawford took the stand on the 11th day of the trial. He was wearing his full dress uniform, ribbons and medals gleaming, his bearing absolutely correct. The prosecutor approached him with the confidence of someone about to deliver a knockout blow. "Admiral Crawford, you were overseeing the investigation into Colonel Wade's activities, correct?" "That is correct." "And you specifically ordered Petty Officer Brennan to stay away from the arrest operation, did you not?" "I did." "Why was that?" "Because she was emotionally compromised. Her father had been killed in an operation I suspected Wade had compromised. I believed she was too close to the situation to remain objective." "But she disobeyed your orders." "She did. And as a result, Colonel Wade is dead." Crawford was silent for a long moment. The courtroom held its breath. "Yes, Colonel Wade is dead, and I'll tell you something else. He deserved to die." The prosecutor blinked. "Excuse me." "Dalton Wade was a traitor. He sold out American warriors for money. He compromised 18 operations over a period of 16 months. 37 SEALs died in those operations. 37 men who trusted him, who served under his command, who believed he was one of them. And he murdered them for profit. Admiral, the question is whether—" "I'm not finished." Crawford's voice was steel. "Petty Officer Brennan did something I didn't have the courage to do. She looked at a system that was failing, at a legal process that was giving Wade time to destroy evidence and flee, and she made a hard call. The kind of call I've made 100 times in combat. The kind of call every SEAL is trained to make. When the situation is critical, when lives are at stake, when waiting means failure, you act. But this wasn't combat, Admiral. This was American soil. There are laws. Laws that would have let Wade escape. Laws that would have tied us up in court for years while his lawyers filed motions and his political friends made phone calls. Laws that prioritize process over justice." Crawford leaned forward. "I've spent 30 years defending those laws. I believe in them. But I also know that sometimes the system fails. And when it fails, when evil men use its complexity against us, Someone has to step up. The prosecutor tried to recover. Are you saying you condone what Petty Officer Brennan did? I'm saying I understand it. I'm saying that if Nathaniel Brennan were here, if he could see his daughter sitting in this courtroom facing prison for avenging his murder and the murders of his brothers, he'd be proud. Because she did what warriors do. She protected her tribe. Chen didn't even cross-examine. Didn't need to. Crawford had just handed them their entire defense. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Sarah didn't sleep, didn't eat, just waited in the small apartment where she was confined, staring at the ceiling, running through every moment of that morning on the Virginia Ridge. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. The jury foreman stood, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a military bearing, former service member probably, someone who understood. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters outside began chanting. The judge hammered his gavel, calling for order. On the charge of unlawful use of a firearm, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant not guilty. Sarah sat perfectly still, not quite believing what she was hearing. Not guilty on all counts. She looked at James, saw tears streaming down his face. Looked at Chen, saw him trying not to smile. Looked at Admiral Crawford in the gallery, saw him nod once, sharp and decisive. The judge dismissed the jury, thanked them for their service, and turned to Sarah. Petty Officer Brennan, you're free to go. However, I want you to understand something. This jury has shown you mercy. They've chosen to believe that your actions, while technically illegal, were justified by extraordinary circumstances. Don't make them regret that decision. Don't let this verdict become a license for vigilantism. You understand? Yes, Your Honor. Then you're dismissed. Sarah stood, her legs shaky. James crossed the courtroom, pulled her into his arms. She held on to him, feeling like she might fly apart if she let go. Around them, the courtroom slowly cleared. Reporters swarmed outside, hungry for a statement. SEAL team members formed a protective circle, making sure Sarah and James could leave unmolested. They drove back to Coronado in silence, James' hand warm in hers. The Pacific appeared through the car windows, gray and eternal. Home. After 6 months of legal limbo, of house arrest and trial preparation and endless uncertainty, she was finally going home. But something had changed. Sarah could feel it in her bones. She'd crossed a line that day on the Virginia Ridge, taken a life outside the bounds of law or military necessity. And even though a jury had said she was not guilty, even though the system had shown her mercy, she knew the truth. She'd killed Dalton Wade because she wanted him dead, because 18 years of grief and rage had finally found an outlet, because in that moment, looking through the scope, she'd stopped being Petty Officer Sarah Brennan and become something else, something harder, darker, more dangerous. And the worst part, she didn't regret it, couldn't regret it, would do it again without hesitation if given the chance. 3 weeks after the verdict, Sarah received orders transferring her to Dam Neck, Virginia, the East Coast SEAL training facility where her father had served. She'd be working in communications again, coordinating operations, doing what she did best. But there was an addendum to the orders, a personal note from Admiral Crawford. Your father believed that warriors carry scars, both visible and invisible, that the cost of defending what matters is carrying weight others will never understand. You've earned your scars now, Sarah. The question is what you do with them. Do they make you bitter, or do they make you better? That's a choice only you can make. Sarah stood in Arlington National Cemetery one final time before reporting to her new duty station. The morning was cold, frost clinging to the grass between rows of white headstones. She knelt at her father's grave, placed her hand on the cold marble. Hey, Dad, I did it. Wade's dead. Everyone who helped him is either dead or in prison. Your brothers are safe. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I don't know if you'd be proud of how I did it. Don't know if killing him outside the law, outside the rules you taught me to respect, is something you'd approve of. But I know you'd understand. I know you'd see why I couldn't let him walk away." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of distant rain. Sarah closed her eyes, and for just a moment she could feel her father's presence. Not a ghost, not a memory, just a sense of him, solid and real, the way he'd been in that Montana backyard teaching her about discipline and control and making one moment count for everything. "I'm going to be okay," she said softly. "James is with me. Admiral Crawford's looking out for me. I've got a new posting, new missions, new purpose, and I'm going to keep serving, keep protecting, keep making sure that warriors like you don't die for nothing." She stood, rendered a final salute, crisp, perfect, the way he'd taught her. Then Sarah Catherine Brennan turned and walked away from the cemetery, leaving the past behind and stepping into whatever future awaited. She was 26 years old. She'd killed a man and been judged not guilty by a jury of her peers. She'd proven she could make the hardest calls, pull the most impossible triggers, do what needed to be done when the system failed. But she'd also learned something her father never lived long enough to teach her: that justice and revenge aren't always the same thing, that crossing certain lines leaves marks that never fully fade, that sometimes winning costs more than you expect to pay. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, but action carries consequences, and consequences shape who you become. Sarah had acted, she'd paid the price. Now she'd spend the rest of her life figuring out what that price had bought her. The dead could rest now, the living had work to do, and Sarah Catherine Brennan was ready.